Hi, Neal Fugate, and welcome to part 3 of the video series I'm making on understanding the California Association of Realtors RPA, the Residential Purchase Agreement. In this video, we're going to cover pages 1 through 5 of the RPA. And as you may recall, when you get the RPA packet from your agent, there are a number of other documents included. This is the list of all the documents. And just so you know, since I started making the series, another form has been added, and that's the FHDA, which actually comes up second in the packet. It's the Fair Housing Discrimination Advisory, and as I noted here, it was newly added mid-October of 2020. So we'll cover that later in the series. Right now, we're going to focus on the RPA itself, and there's a table of contents available for the RPA. If you would like a sample of that, I'm going to leave a link below the video so you can actually download one of those yourself. And you can also download a sample copy of the RPA too. And actually, I would recommend that because I'm going to go through it pretty much line by line. I'm not going to read it word by word, but I do want to cover each section so that you know what to expect when you're getting into a real estate transaction. That's the whole purpose of this series of videos. So if you want to have a copy of that in front of you as we go through it, that would be great. You can pause the video and download it right now. But I'm going to move forward. Here's page 1 of the RPA. The RPA is the actual contract for the transaction, and only the buyers and the sellers are parties to the agreement. Brokers and their agents are not parties to the agreement. It's between the buyer and the seller. And a good rule of thumb is if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So if it's not in this contract, either as the contract the way it's originally written, or as an addendum, or as a counteroffer that's been approved, then it isn't part of the transaction. That's really important. And just so you know, my goal when representing a buyer is to help them write as clean an offer as possible. That's going to increase the chances that it will be accepted by the seller. In order to do that, up front, I pull the property profile to confirm the seller's name and other details. And I also share any red flags that the property profile might reveal with the buyers. I also provide information about recent comparable sales in the area, and that helps the buyers determine the price that they really want to offer for the property. Whenever possible, I contact the seller's agent before we write the offer, and I do that to confirm the details listed in the multiple listing service. I also find out if the seller is planning on using specific service providers, and I just try to get a feel for what might make an offer more or less attractive to the sellers. Now, just so you know, the reason that I find out if they're planning to use specific service providers, you'll see later in the document that you get to state who those service providers will be if you know up front. And the escrow company and title company, the seller can pretty much decide who that is going to be. So it makes sense when you can to state that in the document when you make the offer. That way you're going to eliminate at least one counter offer from the seller where they counter back and say, we're going to use these providers. That's why I do that. And now on to page 1. Just so you know, the date prepared is the date that the agreement is actually drawn up by the agent. The offer is from the buyer, and I like to confirm the legal names for this space here. The real property address, it goes here, and that information normally is pulled in from the multiple listing service. The purchase price offered is the price that the buyer is offering to pay for the property. And if that isn't changed through an addendum or a revision of some kind, a counteroffer, then if this was signed off as is, that is what the purchase price would be. Close of escrow, you can request that it happens on a specific date or a specific number of days after acceptance of the offer. And as I noted previously, the buyer and the seller are the parties to the agreement. Brokers and their agents are not parties to the agreement. Agency confirms the agency relationship that each agent has with their client. We talked about that more in the first video, which covered Form AD, and that's comes to play here in the agreement. Section C talks about potential competing buyers and sellers. And if you watch the earlier videos, that's covered with Form PRBS. Finance terms are very important, and the buyer states in the agreement that all funds will be good when deposited with the escrow holder. You have to make an initial deposit, which is referred to as the earnest money deposit. And normally actually the larger you can make this, the better, up to 3%. 3% is the amount that a seller can legally go after, the 3% of the purchase price, if there's a breach of contract. So it doesn't make sense to put anything larger than that here, because that's the seller couldn't go over 3% anyway. But you want it to be enough where the offer will be taken seriously. So 2 to 3% is usually a pretty good rule of thumb, depending on the price of the property. A1 states that the buyer will use direct deposit. The buyer shall deliver direct deposit directly to escrow holder by electronic funds, or you can use a cashier's check or a personal check or other means of payment if you would like, but it has to be within 3 business days after acceptance of the offer, unless both parties agree to a different date here. I highlighted Section 2 because sometimes a buyer will want to give an agent the check to take to escrow, and some companies may do that, but eXp Realty does not. We never touch the money because we don't have a trust fund log. Our offices are virtual, so we don't have a physical place to hold a check in the trust fund. Increased deposits are sometimes used by buyers, but it's not very common. If for some reason it suited your situation, we could talk about that in more detail. With an all-cash offer, you don't have to show financing because you're going to pay cash, but you do have to show that you have the money available, and you have to show proof of that within 3 days after acceptance, unless a different date is agreed upon by the parties involved. Normally, there's a first loan taken for the amount of the difference between the earnest money deposit and the down payment, and that amount would go here. You have to state in the offer if it's going to be conventional financing, or if you're going to use FHA or VA financing. Seller financing isn't very common these days, but if that's the case, then you also need to use a separate form for that. Assumed financing is almost never done anymore, so I'm not going to touch on that. But in the offer, you also have to state that it will be a fixed rate, if that's the case, not to exceed a certain percentage rate, or an adjustable rate loan with an initial rate not to exceed a certain percentage rate, and then also the number of points that will be paid for the financing. Now, I would normally talk to the buyer's loan officer to get an idea of what figures to put here, but you really don't want to leave these blank, or you're going to leave it wide open. If for whatever reason you couldn't get the loan that you thought you could, and this was blank, the seller could literally press you to get other financing at any percentage rate. and that doesn't protect you. So I normally talk to the loan officer and ask them what kind of range this should be at, and go use their guidance to fill this in. But it's really to protect the buyer. Second loans are not very common either. If there was a situation where one was needed, I would go over that in detail with the buyer. If it's going to be a FHA or VA loan, then it has to be specified here. And the buyer has 17 or other days, if specified, after acceptance to deliver to the seller car form FVA. And that discusses any lender-required repairs or costs that the buyer will request the seller to pay or otherwise correct. And just so you know, the seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy lender requirements unless they agree to in writing. And there's another form if it's a FHA or VA needed to include with the agreement as well. That's the FVAC. If there are additional financing terms, they would be listed here. That would be case by case, and we could talk about that if the situation called for that. The balance of the down payment would go here, and the total purchase price would go here. The buyers and the sellers initial at the bottom of the page. On to page 2. Section H deals with verification of down payment and closing costs. And within 3 days after acceptance of the offer, the buyer has to show that they have the money available to close this deal, the money that they show in the earnest money deposit and the down payment that they're going to give their lender. They have to prove or show evidence that they have that money that they can access and will be able to close the deal. And you have 3 days, but actually I encourage buyers to include a copy of their most recent bank statement with any sensitive information blocked out, to include that with the offer. And that helps show that you're making a strong offer as well. Section I deals with the appraisal contingency and removal. By default, the agreement is contingent upon a written appraisal by a licensed certified appraiser of no less than the purchase price offered. And that is a contingency by default. We'll cover that more in section 14, which is later in the agreement. The loan term section states that within 3 days after acceptance, the buyer needs to deliver a letter from their lender or the loan broker stating that they have been approved for the loan. I like to include a pre-approval letter with the offer as well, but you actually have 3 days to produce that information if needed. This loan contingency section talks about the fact that the buyer will diligently try to get the loan. Section 3 states that the loan contingency removal will be within 21 days or another number of days if agreed upon by both parties after acceptance. And we'll talk about that more about when we get to all the loan contingencies later in the agreement as well. You also have the option of no loan contingency, but I don't recommend that, so I normally don't suggest checking this box. Section 5 talks about the lender limits on buyer credits. In lieu of writing a check or reducing the purchase price, if there are repairs needed to be made, many times the seller will give a credit to the buyer. And this states that any buyer credits have to be approved by the lender, and the lender has to be aware of them. Section K deals with buyer stated financing and basically says that the buyer in good faith has presented this information and that everything is true. Section 4, if the buyer needs to sell their property in order to obtain the financing, that needs to be stated. But the default for the agreement is that the buyer's ability to obtain financing is not contingent upon the sale of any property owned by the buyer. If the buyer needs to sell their property, they need to check Section B here, and also include another form, which is the form COP. Various additional addenda and advisories can be part of the agreement. And those would go here. For instance, if it was known that there was a septic system on the property, you would probably want to check this box here, and the other ones as they apply. The only one in the buyer and seller advisories that is a default is the buyer's inspection advisory is to be included with the agreement, and it's part of that download packet that I listed earlier in the video. Other terms can be listed here, and those would vary case by case. The allocation of costs for the inspections and reports and certificates, if applicable, go here. Inspection reports and certificates can be paid for either by the buyer or the seller. And unless the buyer is going to pay for the NHD report, that's the Natural Hazard Zone Disclosure Report, then the seller, you would check that here, and the seller could actually request who it was going to be used by. The verbiage that I would use in this section of the document would be seller to choose company, and then in section 2, normally you want to ask for a wood-destroying pest and organism report and request that the seller pay for that, and that would go here. Those are really the two items that are standard, so if there was anything additional, it would be on a case-by-case situation, and that would go here as well. And for the government requirements and retrofits, it's normal, at least in my market, for the seller to pay for those. So we would go ahead and mark seller to pay for those reports and retrofits right there. Page 3 talks about the cost of compliance with other minimum mandatory government inspections and reports. And I normally suggest that the buyer request the seller to pay for those, and for any other minimum mandatory retrofit standards required as a condition of closing escrow under the law. I would suggest that the buyer request the seller pay for those as well. Escrow and title, unless the seller is paying for all the costs of escrow, then the buyer and the seller would normally pay their own share. And that would be stated here. The escrow holder would be stated here, what company is actually going to do it. And like I said, I would talk to the seller's agent beforehand and find out if they already have an escrow holder that they specifically want to use, because it just makes sense to add that here to avoid any confusion and to avoid any counteroffers by the seller. This section states that within 5 days, unless otherwise agreed upon, the buyer and the seller will sign and return the escrow holder's general provisions. This section talks about the owner's title insurance policy, and the seller will normally determine who that provider will be, and that goes here. And the buyer would pay for any title policy insuring the buyer's lender unless otherwise agreed upon in writing. Other costs, depending on what the cost is, most of these would fall to the seller to pay, but we would go through them each when you're writing up a contract and and determine if that's the case in your situation. Normally, in Section 10, a home warranty is requested that the seller pay for it, and in my market, the normal price is between $450, $550 for an upgraded version, and that's what I suggest that the buyer requests, and that the provider can be determined before the contract is written or after, depending on if the buyer knows who they want to use or not. But if the property has air conditioning or a pool, then we definitely want to include those here. And in rare situations, I don't think I've ever recommended a buyer waives the purchase of a home warranty plan, but you can do that if you want. If it, for some reason, suits your situation, then we could talk about that in greater detail. Item 8 deals with items included in and excluded from the sale. Now, in the multiple listing service, in the description, it's going to talk about things that are included in the purchase along with the sale, but we want to confirm that. You may remember at the beginning of this video, I said if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. That's what this section deals with. So you just want to be very thorough, and if you want the things that are stated in the MLS, like the refrigerator or whatever, then we need to state that in these sections here. And if there are any other items that are that we want to note, like maybe there's a chandelier that you saw when you toured the home or something like that, you would want to put that here. And likewise, if there are any leased or liened items and systems, those need to be covered in this section. And then, and this is also very important, if there are solar panels on the home, it needs to be clarified what the current situation is with those. And in Section C, we talk about items excluded from sale. Once again, you would look at the MLS, and that should give you a pretty good clue. But if there are specific items, say there's a play set in the backyard that the buyer doesn't want to be there when they take possession, you would want to state that here. And so, any fixtures should go along with the property. Those are attached items. But for clarification, it doesn't hurt to include those in the section above as well. Section 9A, buyers need to state whether they intend or not to occupy the property as their primary residence, and that needs to be clarified here. In Section B, the possession is confirmed after close of escrow, and the default is 6 p.m. on the date of close of escrow, unless another time is agreed upon by the parties, and that is included here. Now, it defaults to the date of close of escrow. If the seller needs to stay in the property, then it needs to be stated here for a specific number of calendar days after close of escrow, or a specific time on a specific date here. And that's very important, because if the seller is going to stay in the property after the close of escrow, anytime at all, then that has to be agreed on by both parties, and another form has to accompany the agreement, and that is the California Association of Realtors form SIP, which is the seller continued occupancy of less than 30 days. Even if it's one day after close of escrow, we need to have that document. And if it's going to be over 30 days, there's another form that needs to be included. If it's tenant-occupied property, then The property needs to be vacant at least 5 days prior to the close of escrow, unless otherwise agreed upon by the parties involved. If the tenant is going to remain in possession, there's another form as well. Section E talks about what happens at close of escrow. And then at close of escrow, the buyer is going to get the keys, all the passwords and codes that are needed to operate all the locks and mailboxes, security systems, etc. From the seller. Section 10 talks about statutory and other disclosures, including the lead-based paint, hazard advisories, and cancellation rights. So in section 14, which is going to come up on page 6, there are a number of disclosures that the seller will need to provide, and those are all talked about here. And see here in section 3, waiver of statutory and lead disclosures is prohibited by law. So within a certain time frame stated in section 14A, the seller needs to provide all of the disclosures unless they are exempt. These are some other stipulations. If the seller or their broker become aware of adverse conditions which materially affect the property, they need to disclose it to the parties involved. And B states that an NHD report is part of the agreement. That's covered in depth in section 14A. These disclosures are part of the agreement and need to be included and provided to the buyer by the seller. On page 5, it talks about whether or not property is a condominium or not, and you should know that up front, but the seller needs to state it. That would be covered in the property profile, and that would be something that we would confirm before writing the offer. If for some reason, but as part of the agreement, the seller has to state that it is condominium or part of a planned development, and request from the HOA copies of any documents required by law. Section 11 covers condition of property. And the property is sold as is. Sometimes you see sellers stating that in the multiple listing service, but the default of the contract is that it is sold as is and in its present physical condition at the time of acceptance. It is also subject to the buyer's investigations, and the buyer has rights to investigate the property. That includes the pool, the spa, and the landscaping and the grounds. And the seller is stating that they will maintain it in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance, and that they will remove all debris and personal property not included in the sale by the close of escrow. The seller also states that they're going to disclose all known material facts and defects, and the buyer, this restates that the buyer has the right to conduct investigations of the property as stated in paragraph 14B, which is coming up on page 6. This reiterates that the buyer is strongly advised to conduct an investigation of the entire property and needs to determine its present condition, and because there may be things that the seller is not aware of. But you have a right as a buyer to do your property inspections, and I always urge my buyer to do that as quickly as possible in the transaction. Section 12 goes in great depth, and we would actually go through that if we were writing up this contract so that you understand your rights as a buyer. Section 12B states that the seller will make the property available for all buyer investigations. And it goes on to state that the buyer will complete their investigations and either remove the contingency or cancel the agreement according to the terms in Section 14B. And this is important also. The buyer states that they will give the seller at no cost complete copies of any and all investigations and reports that the buyer makes, and this obligation shall survive the termination of the agreement. So if you're in escrow and you're the buyer and you've made a number of inspections and property inspections and that sort of thing, you need to give copies of those to the seller, even if you cancel the agreement. That's what that means, because the seller is obligated to include those as disclosures to any buyers that may come after you. Section D talks about the buyer's responsibility to the seller. The buyer will keep the property free and clear of all liens, and if there is any repair or damage due to the buyer's investigations, the buyer will hold the seller harmless and make sure that those damages are repaired at the buyer's cost. Anyone representing the buyer shall carry policies of liability, workers' compensation, and other applicable insurance, defending and protecting the seller from liability for any injuries to persons or properties occurring during the buyer's investigations. Section 13 goes into detail about title investing. As part of the agreement, there will be a preliminary title report issued, and part of the investigation is for the buyers to go through the preliminary report and make sure some of those red flags aren't showing up in it. The buyer will also need to decide how they want to take title to the property, and there will also need to be a homeowner's policy of title insurance issued, and these sections are really in-depth about that. I would go over it in greater detail with you if you were writing up a contract, but just so you know, there's going to be a preliminary title report issued, and that's going to give you a lot of information that you will want to go through thoroughly while your inspection and contingency periods are still in effect. This brings us to page 6. As noted, this video is going through page 6. As you can see, there's a lot of detail to this form, which is why I wanted to break it down into smaller chunks. So this is as far as we'll go in this video. We'll continue part 4 right here. And thanks for watching Understanding the RPA Part 3. In the next section, we will continue with the RPA itself. Feel free to download your copy of the RPA table of contents or a sample RPA below. And if you have any questions for me, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. And as always, I'm here to help. Thanks.